Why is it that you and your colleagues became interested in the topic of mealtime and food?
This, for me, is a really wonderful collaborative project. So I study how children think and how they learn language. And I'm collaborating with a pediatrician, Julie Lumang, who's interested in childhood eating patterns and childhood obesity. And we got together on this project through Jasmine DeJesus, who was a postdoc working with both of us. And so there's a lot of interest in why childhood obesity rates have been rising in recent years, what contributes to this, but really not very much from the standpoint of the child. It's more looking at sort of what the environment is like. But we know that children aren't just passively taking in whatever's around them. So we thought that it would be really important to look at how children are responding in the moment when they hear language from their parents in an actual eating context. And surprisingly, there was almost nothing known about that.
Tell me a little bit about the most recent study itself.
It was more open-ended, so it's part of a longitudinal study looking at a variety of facets of childhood eating, maternal factors, socioeconomic factors, but the goal of it was to look at children in low-income families and what predicted children's eating patterns. So it was a large sample. It was 234 families. And in this piece of the project, which was only one part of this larger project, we had a very structured task. So it was very controlled, but at the same time, it was very natural. And by that, what I mean is we looked at how parents interacted with their children when being given different foods to try, and they were free to talk as much or as little as they wanted. There were no directions given to them in terms of how they should interact with their kids. So that was just like very natural behavior that was unfolding. But each family had the same protocol, which is they got a series of 4 foods, 4 minutes per food. So the mom and the child would sit together. An experimenter would come in and give them, each a cupcake. They had 4 minutes to eat as much as they wanted or as little as they wanted, say whatever they thought was appropriate. They didn't have to talk about food at all if they didn't want to. And we went through the 4 foods. So there were 2 desserts and 2 vegetables. And then of those, one was familiar and one was unfamiliar. So we had, for the vegetables, we had green beans and artichoke hearts. And for the desserts, we had cupcakes and a food called halva, which was unfamiliar to most of the families, but it's kind of a nut-based sweet dessert.
Over what period of time did you say that?
It took about 2 years to collect the data for that structured eating protocol. And then it took another several years to transcribe all of the conversations, to code them all. They were coded very precisely in terms of the kind of language that was being used, and then to conduct the analyses.
What did you find?
What we found was really interesting, I think. So our main question was what would predict what children were eating and how much they were eating. And, as I said, we had these very detailed codes of what parents were saying in these conversations. None of that predicted how much children were eating. So that was a surprise. But what we did find is how much the moms were eating was predictive of how much the children were eating. So children seemed to be attentive to what the moms were doing more so than what they were saying.
What kinds of foods Were the children eating more of?
Yes, they did have a preference for the desserts over the vegetables, but also they had a preference for the familiar foods over the unfamiliar foods. And you know, the cupcakes and the halva were like very kind of nutritiously dense. So even if they didn't finish the cupcakes, they were consuming more calories from those. But you know, one piece of the data that we haven't really fully unpacked yet is this question of how children are persuaded to try novel foods. So in our data, this effect of do what I do, not as I say, held for all 4 foods. So both, you know, in terms of the effect of maternal eating and child eating. So that was not specific to any particular type of food.
So if moms ate more dessert quickly, the children would model that behavior?
Yes.
What do these findings suggest then, and what kind of parent takeaways come from it?
Well, I think it shows that children are really savvy. They're going beyond just what parents are saying to really attending to the behaviors they see their parents modeling. And so I think one big takeaway is that parents, you know, if they want their child to eat in a certain way, they should model that behavior themselves. They should eat foods that they want their child to try, and not just talk the talk, but walk the walk. There was another aspect of our data that was sort of surprising to me, and I don't know if I have a good explanation for it, though we have some hypotheses. And this was, in addition to finding, you know, these effects, we also found that the moms who themselves were overweight were less likely to talk about food at all. They were almost silent about food compared to the other moms. And, you know, we have a few different hypotheses about why that might be. So we know that there's a lot of stigma around being overweight in our culture, and the moms know that they were being video recorded as they were engaged in these interactions. So they may have sort of censored themselves and been uncomfortable talking about food because they didn't know how that would be evaluated. It's also possible that they understand that there are biological factors that might put a child into one weight group or another, and so they may be sensitive to the idea that what they say may not make much of a difference. So they may be intuitively picking up on something that is, you know, insightful about what's going on. There may be other factors as well, we don't know.
Why is information like this in our day and age so important?
We know that childhood obesity is a big issue in today's society, and we also know that it's easier to prevent obesity in an individual than it is to reverse it. You know, unfortunately, childhood obesity often persists, or even in adults, that often persists. So it's important to understand early in development what are the factors that contribute to healthy eating, because those are going to have consequences potentially throughout a child's life. And then, as I was saying before, you know, when a child, if you want to understand this issue, you don't want to leave out the part of the child. You don't only want to look at what parents are doing or only look at what's in the environment, but also look at how children are taking that in, what are they sensitive to. I mean, we have other research showing that kids are very sensitive to sort of implicit cues in language. It's not even always the explicit messages that a parent is using, but sometimes how a parent says it that can make a difference. So, I mean, this is outside the realm of what you're focused on, but we had a project looking at the messages that parents convey to children about gender. And in this particular sample, the parents were highly educated, very sort of feminist leaning as a whole, and they would say very egalitarian things about gender. You know, that girls and boys can both be firefighters and that sort of thing. But then some of the implicit messages were actually reinforcing gender stereotypes, and the parents didn't even know it. So I think there's a richness to the kind of information that kids are getting from their parents. Sometimes we're aware of it, and we can be mindful of that as we're talking to our kids, but sometimes it's at a level that kids may be picking up on, but we're not even really aware that those messages are getting through.
Do you have any other takeaway tips for parents? How do I make sure that we're preventing obesity rather than getting to a point where we do have to try to reverse it?
When we started the study, I think we were hopeful that there would be some linguistic indicators that would be highly predictive of healthier eating patterns in the children. That would have been lovely to find. You know, that would have been really, really important. And we didn't find it. Is that because there's no influence of language? Or is it because it is at a level perhaps that we didn't tap into yet? We don't know. So I would say that, you know, not based on these data, because as I said, we didn't find connections between what parents were saying and children's eating behavior. But we know from other work that children are very sensitive to, well, children care about why. They don't just care about, you know, what people do, but they care about why people do it. There have been other studies showing that in sort of more controlled experimental manipulations, explaining to children why a food is healthy and what positive consequences it might have. So they're not just learning rules of do this, don't do that, but they really understand the reasons behind it. Personally, I think that is a very promising direction, and I think that would be a positive thing for parents to do. So not only I told you you have to eat the green beans, but here are the positive consequences of eating the green beans. So I'm still hopeful that that may turn out to be beneficial.
Is there anything I didn't ask you, Susan, that you would want people to know?
There's one other aspect of our data that I thought was potentially very important. And that is, I mentioned this is a low-income group of families. They were recruited through Head Start, and about 30% or 1/3 of the families had what's called food insecurity, meaning that they didn't have sufficient funds to always have the quality or quantity of food that they desired to have. And we found that the patterns that I told you about kids being attentive to how much the parents were eating and sort of modeling that in their own eating, that pattern didn't hold up in the food insecure group. It only held up in the food secure group. So if a child is growing up in an environment where people in the family do have to worry about whether they can put the food on the table and have access to the foods that they know that their kids should be getting, that seems to change the relationship of what children are taking in observing what's going on. So how much parents ate did not predict what the kids were eating in the food insecure families. We still found that they ate more desserts than vegetables, but we didn't find that that same pattern where they were sort of modeling what the parents were doing.